for inviting me and my co-authors to be a part of this workshop. So this paper is co-authored with my brother João and Paulo Monteiro from the University of York. Our paper is about the origins of monetary policy disagreement and the role of supply and demand shocks. Our empirical analysis actually ends in Janet Yellen's term at the end of 2018, but this is actually a very relevant topic for the current time period, because now we have observed this year with the pandemic, the return of inflation, the return of supply shocks through global supply chains, through labor markets, and we are very likely to see disagreement for monetary policy in the future. And then this is relevant for the topic of the workshop, which is forward guidance, because as you explained earlier, and also Nakata at the beginning of the workshop, forward guidance requires commitment. But if there is increased disagreement about the role of monetary policy, then the chair of the Fed is likely to face lower possibilities for committing to his preferred monetary policy because other members may disagree with him in the future. So now, well, this will be about the Federal Open Market Committee and this agreement. It has 12 members, 7 permanent members from the Board of Governors in DC, the New York Fed president in financial markets, and also 4 rotating members among the regional reserve bank presidents. It is tasked with setting monetary policy. It has a dual mandate about price stability, inflation, and full employment. And it meets regularly. Typically, for the last 30 years, it meets twice a quarter. So every 8 weeks or 8 times a year. And it sets the federal funds rate. Before that, it used to set monetary policy growth. All the 12 participating members of the committee vote, and they can either support the chairman's proposal or oppose it, which would be a vote of dissent. If we look at the votes, we see that there is much fewer dissent than, for example, at the Bank of England. I believe at the Bank of England, about 35% of the votes are against the chairman. But at the Fed, we observed that in the history of the Fed, overall, only 6.5% of the votes were against the proposed policy of the chairman. Now, you could think, oh, if it's only 6% among 12 votes, maybe we shouldn't care about this. But the fact is that we should care. One, if we observe across different terms of the chairman, we see that every chairman has dissent in its committee. Some of them have faced fewer dissent, like Greenspan, 5%, or Chairman Martin, who was at the Fed almost 20 years. But others, like Volcker or Miller, face more than 10% or 17%. And more recently, well, Bernanke and Yellen, they faced quite a bit more dissent than Greenspan. And if we observe among different quarters, we see that almost 2/3 of the quarters have some dissent votes. These dissent votes can either be for tighter policy, meaning people that are more hawkish than the chairman, they would prefer a stronger stance against inflation, or for easier policy. And then on much rarer occasions, there are dissent for other reasons. Perhaps they don't exactly agree with the views of the chairman, although they may agree with the policy. But they don't exactly agree perhaps with the economic outlook. But what we observe is that even Greenspan faced dissent on 1/3 of the quarters during his mandate, but others faced dissent almost 60% of the time, or even in the case of Chairman Miller, who was only 1 year and a half, he faced dissent 100% of the time. So we want to explain what drives this.
Carlos,
is this about?
Sorry.
Yes.
That seems to me, if you want to use the jargon, it seems to me almost like the extensive margin, right? And the intensive would be how much do they disagree? You're looking at that as well?
Yes. Yes, we do.
Okay.
So here, this is, one could think perhaps this is just about a grumpy man or woman in the meeting room, but it isn't. Maybe it is someone that wants to disagree 2/3 of the time, or even 100% of the time, and then that person disappears. But if we look at the number of people that have dissented, we see that 79 members of the committee have dissented. This among 148 members over the last 65 years. So more than half of the members have disagreed at some point. And we observe that several people have disagreed with the chairman, whoever he was, whether Greenspan, Bernanke, Yellen, or Chairman Martin. So this is not about a problem of a single grumpy person in the room. And then we can also observe about the persistence of this disagreement. So we can compute the frequency of disagreement among different members. So members in the percentile 25 are people who disagree very little. Those in the 50, they are the median, and in the 75, they are the ones with most disagreement. But even the ones in the percentile 75, the ones that are most against the chairman, one observes that they only vote against the chairman's proposal about 17% of the time. Even in Bernanke and Yellen, they had the most persistent dissenters. The most persistent ones, the most harder to persuade, they only voted against the chairman about 1/3 of the time. The person who voted against more times in the Federal Open Market Committee history were Chairman Lacker and also George. And they only voted about 50% of the times against the chairman. And those were the members who disagreed most in the entire history of the Fed. Now, to relate this to past literature, we know that committees in central banks, they aggregate private information and the diversity of views from different members. And this has been shown by Gerlach Christen, by Anson, and Michael, who was with us at the beginning of the workshop. It has been shown that there is heterogeneity of preferences in committee members, both in the Fed, but also in the Bank of England. In the Bank of England, there is actually a lot of dissent against the chairman. And then there has been a lot of research about monetary policy surprises around open market committees. So Gorodnichenko and Weber, they show that monetary policy surprises affect stock market volatility in the day of the meeting, and more precisely, they affect volatility around the 30 minutes of the announcement of the new interest rate. And in a work with my brother, recently published on Ristat, we show that dissent matters for stock markets. So dissent is usually only 1 or 2 members. And one could think, what does 1 or 2 members matter among 12? What matters is that the chairman always gets approved. It doesn't matter if there are 5 or 10% of people against him in the room. But the fact is that stock markets, they interpret unanimity and dissent in different ways. So we show that stock markets appreciate when there is an unanimous announcement of the interest rates, and stock markets depreciate when they observe some dissent, even if there is just 1 or 2 votes against. And the interpretation that we make about this is that market agents, they view the committee at the Fed as a sort of a gentleman's club. Perhaps there are more people who disagree in the room, but once they see 1 or 2 votes against, the other disagreeing members, they abstain to vote because they considered that would be sort of just being against the chairman in an unnecessary way. So we showed that in previous research that disagreement matters, and market agents see that it matters. But now, what causes different members to disagree? And well, this has been studied by Thornton and Wheelock from the St. Louis Fed. And in 2014, they saw there is a big puzzle about why different members disagree. If we run a disagreement on macroeconomic conditions, such as unemployment, GDP growth, output gap, we don't seem to be able to explain it. Those coefficients come up with a value of 0. So here what we propose is that the reason why inflation and output gap don't matter is because what matters is the origin of the shock. And shocks are interpreted differently by different committee members if they come from supply side or from the demand side. And the reason is that supply shocks, they affect inflation and output gap in a different way. So a negative supply shock increases inflation, but it decreases output. And therefore, different members that have different views about how hawkish they can be about inflation, how concerned they should be about full employment, they will have different views about a supply shock. When there is a demand shock increases inflation, and it also increases output. So even if you have different preferences, at least you are more likely to agree about the direction of future monetary policy. We show that this result is valid in empirical data, but also in theory, and that the result remains valid and robust, even if we control for different forecasts and disagreement about the future among different committee members. So this is a sign that our result is driven by different preferences on the hawkish and dovish side, and not just about different expectations about the future. We identified the model using a DSG model, a standard one like Smets and Wouters, but then we also use a structural VAR model that is more agnostic and has just some sign restrictions. And the result is also robust to different specifications, such as using IV and narrative shocks, such as gasoline prices, expenses, and the Romer and Romer monetary policy shock surprises. So basically, we show that inflation volatility is caused by supply shocks, and this also increases uncertainty among the future path of interest rates. And the disagreement and supply shocks are both causal in determining disagreement about the expectations of future interest rates. This is related to the topic of the workshop, because if there is disagreement about the chairman's monetary policy, then it makes forward guidance harder when there are supply shocks.
Carlos, sorry, just to clarify the causality here. So are you saying that a shock causes disagreement, like you said, hawkish, dovish, at the board? And then you're saying that the disagreement of the board causes disagreement of the future path of the interest rates.
Yes. And the supply shock too, because you can think if shocks are persistent, then the Asians think, oh, a supply shock is going to drive more disagreement and more uncertainty about the future monetary policy.
Right. And do you consider that it's not necessarily preference? It might be, I'm pretty sure that that's a solid story, preference of the board members, but could it be that the uncertainty of the times perhaps are causing, so essentially they don't know the magnitude of the shock, and that's why some of them have one view versus the other?
Well, that's a very good question. We do control for that because we use dispersion in forecasts from the different committee members, which are available from the book that they deliver every 6 months to Congress. And then we also use stock market volatility as a measure for uncertainty, which we get from Bloom and all. Okay, so now I will start with the theoretical model. The theoretical model is a very simple new Keynesian model, which was also used by different authors in the same workshop this morning. So we have one equation, which is the Phillips curve. And then we have an equation for output gap and an equation for the preferred monetary policy of the chairman. Then we introduce different committee members that have different preferences from the chairman. They can be hawkish or dovish, and they differ in terms of the weight they give to inflation stabilization versus employment stabilization. And since policy is decided in terms of incremental steps of 25 basis points, 50 basis points, then there is monetary policy disagreement if you have a different preference from the chairman that differs in terms of more than a certain number of basis points. Here is what we show. So here in blue, we have the demand shocks. And here we have in green the output, the supply shocks. And they affect inflation and output gap in different ways. A supply shock increases inflation and lowers output gap. A demand shock affects inflation and output gap in the same way. If it reduces inflation, it also reduces output gap. And if it increases inflation, then it also increases output gap. And here we show what happens in a calibrated model with hawks and doves that differ from the chairman. Here in this specification, they differ both in terms of their preference for inflation stabilization and for employment, full employment. And here we show that when there is a supply shock, the fraction of votes against the chairman is both higher and more persistent than when there is a demand shock. Here we show that this result is attenuated if members are only allowed to differ in terms of inflation preferences. So here, for this result between, for the difference between supply and demand shocks, it's crucial that coax and doves, they differ not only in terms of their preference for inflation stability, but also in terms of their preference for full employment. But that is consistent with the empirical literature, because previous literature has determined that coax and doves, both of them care somewhat about inflation and full employment, but to different degrees. So this assumption is consistent with the empirical literature. We estimate this ESG model, a very standard Smets and Woods model. It includes sticky prices and wages, habit formation in consumption, investment adjustment costs, and it includes 7 shocks, which have free supply shocks, productivity, price and wage markups, and then 4 demand shocks, monetary policy, spending, risk premium, and investment. And we estimate it using Bayesian techniques and a medium scale model that has a 7 time series at the quarterly level. These are the results for the impulse response functions. So supply shocks drive output and inflation in a different way, and demand shocks and monetary shocks, they are sort of similar in the sense that they drive output and inflation and interest rates in the same direction. So demand and monetary shocks, although they have different origins, they have a similar impact on the macroeconomy. Here is our decomposition. This goes for about 70 years. So since the 1950s, we see that, for example, in the 1950s, there were lots of demand shocks and monetary shocks. So that was a period of low descent. But the 1960s had lots of supply shocks, the late 1960s, the 70s, the early 80s, and those were periods with very high descent against the chairman. Miller, Volcker, they had high descent rates. But just as Greenspan came in, the supply shocks decreased in value, and there were more demand shocks. And this was something that happened through the 90s and also during Bernanke's and Yellen's mandates. So they had more demand shocks, and they also had lower disagreement rates than Volcker and Miller. Here we show, we map the different shocks with descent. So if we look at supply shocks and descent, we see that the lines almost coincide at the quarterly level. But for demand shocks, it is not like that, right? So for demand shocks, we see lots of periods with large demand shocks, but had low disagreement. And the same for monetary shocks. Monetary shocks, we see lots of periods that had large monetary shocks, but didn't have disagreement. And the same if we consider demand and monetary shocks put together. Now, we try to see if our theoretical model is right in practice. So we estimate an equation, an empirical regression with different measures of disagreement. One is the fraction of dissent votes. One is a dummy for whether dissent happened in that quarter. And then we also have dummies for whether dissent was for tighter, meaning on the hawkish side, or for easier, whether it was a dove that dissented. Here, this is the specification that was made by Thornton and Wheelock in the previous literature. They included inflation, they included unemployment or output gap, but they didn't have any explanation. These coefficients were about 0 and non-significant. And then they have Sherman fixed effects. This matters a lot, and time fixed effects. Now we include the absolute value of the supply, demand, and monetary shocks that we estimated from our DSGE model. We show first the regression with the fraction of distant votes. And here we replicate the results of Thornton and Wheelock. So inflation and unemployment don't matter, especially once we have Sherman and time dummies, and they are not significant. But even if we have Sherman and year time dummies, we find that our supply shock is always significant and positive in terms of driving more votes of dissent. And the demand shock and the monetary shock, they are always negatively associated with the fraction of dissent votes. If we include the demand, the sum of the demand and monetary shock, then we have things even more significant. How does this change if we change from the fraction of dissent votes to a dummy? Dissent happened or not? Results are very similar. As I told you, dissent is always either 1 or 2 dissent votes. So suppose that there was only 1 vote of dissent over time. Then the fraction is 1 in 12 members. If we would have this with a dummy, we would multiply these coefficients 12 times, and we would get the dummy variable model exactly. In practice, sometimes we have 1 vote of dissent about 2/3 of the time, and sometimes we have 2 votes of dissent. If there were always 2 votes of dissent, we would multiply these coefficients by 6, and then we would get the dummy variable exactly. Since in practice it's a mix between 1 and 2 votes, then we will, if we would multiply something between 6 and 12, we would get the dummy variable results. And that's exactly what we have. You will see later in the next tables that the coefficients with the dummy variables are about 8 times larger than these coefficients in this table. So this is what happens with dissent as a dummy variable. We always find that supply shock drives dissent, increases dissent. It also increases especially more dissent on the hawkish side, and less so, and it is not significant if dissent is for the dovish side, because maybe the doves care less about inflation. And the demand and monetary policy shock are always associated with positive dissent, whether for tighter or for easier. And as I said, these coefficients, as expected, they are about 8 times larger than the previous table. So dissent on the extensive and intensive side happen very similarly in this model, as Victor asked. Now we try to control, this was also asked by Victor, whether it is preferences or disagreement about expectations. And we use expectations, disagreement in expectations for inflation and unemployment since 1980, that the committee sends to Congress every 6 months. And here what we show is that we find similar results. Disagreement, the fraction of votes of disagreement is not driven by inflation, not by unemployment, not by disagreement in expectations, it is driven by supply shocks, and on the negative side by demand shocks, or by the sum of demand and monetary shocks. We are almost ending, but right now this is like a Batman movie. We already did one fight, now it's the same fight until the end. Now we replicate the results with panel data. So now we have all the 12 members and we have panel data. We can control by the members fixed effects, and we can also control by the experience of the members and the time that they have faced with the chairman, which would be the chairman's experience in controlling and interacting with these members. But we have very similar results and almost the same coefficients. So supply shocks, they increase descent, whether any kind of descent, whether hawkish descent or easier descent. And demand and monetary shocks, they decrease descent, any type of descent, hawkish descent, and also easier descent. Here, this was also another question from the audience. We control for uncertainty. We use Bloom's stock market volatility, which is another measure similar to disagreement about uncertainty, and the results are robust. This is like a Batman movie. It is always robust. And then, since the DSGE may have some problems, we also use a structural VAR model with sign restrictions and instrumental variables, and we find very similar results. These are the comparison for supply shocks between the structural VAR and the DSGE. They are sort of similar. They are a little bit less similar for the estimation of the demand shocks, but in the end, we have the same results. So supply shocks are associated with a higher disagreement and demand shocks with lower disagreement. And then what about forward guidance, the topic of this workshop? So basically, we show it is reasonable to think that market agents may think if supply shocks drive disagreement now and in the future, then there will be more uncertainty and more disagreement among different forecasters when there are supply shocks. We use the survey of professional forecasters, which was also used before in this workshop, and it provides data for expectations for the current quarter, because forecasts are made in the beginning of each quarter, and then for 1, 2, 3, 4 quarters ahead. And then there are some expectations for some years ahead. And we use the disagreement among forecasters at each horizon since 1981 until now. Here what we show is that forecasters disagree more when there is higher inflation and when there is higher unemployment. And when we add the supply and the demand plus monetary shocks, we find at every time horizon, whether the current quarter or 1, 2, 3 until 1 year ahead, supply shocks drive higher disagreement among professional forecasters, and demand shocks reduce disagreement, at least for the current quarter and 1 to 2 quarters ahead. And this is significant, not just in terms, of the sign and the statistical significance, but it also increases a lot the explanation power of the model. So the R-square, by adding 2 variables, increases from 40% to 54%. So our model increases a lot the power to explain disagreement, both among committee members, but also among market agents. And if there is higher disagreement, it is likely to be a problem for forward guidance in the future. And basically with that I end. So what I showed you is that supply shocks drive a wedge because they drive employment and inflation in different ways. But demand shocks, they drive inflation and output gap or employment growth in the same direction. So supply shocks are more likely to cause disagreement among committee members, and demand shocks actually reduce disagreement because inflation and employment growth are going in the same direction. And even if you have different preferences, members can agree about that. This was the year of the return of the supply shocks from labor markets, from global supply chains. So it's a topic very up to date, and they will likely see more disagreement and uncertainty and disagreement in the future. Thank you.
Thanks, Carlos. Very interesting. Are there any questions? I had a couple of questions of my own. The first one is, I guess, beating a dead dog, but it's about the truncation of the zero lower bound, in the sense that, have you perhaps focused on that period and see whether disagreement is lower? In the sense, again, they're not talking about shadow rates, or at least I don't think they are. And regardless of the disagreement on the shadow rates, you know, they all agree on the zero lower bound binding this period. So either, I'm not sure if you can get any data on shadow rates, but you could perhaps get data on expected liftoffs or something like this. So essentially, do you see less disagreement of the FOMC during the zero lower bound?
Yes, actually, that's a very good question. We do observe less disagreement during the period of the zero lower bound, because I guess the zero lower bound is all about the demand shock. For our previous paper, the one that was measuring the impact of dissent on the stock markets, we actually showed that there was an effect, a difference between unanimous and disagreement meetings, and that effect was separate, whether it was before the Great Financial Crisis, during the Great Financial Crisis, and during the zero lower bound period. In the case of this empirical model, we actually didn't estimate a different model because here we are working with macroeconomic variables instead of financial market variables. And therefore the macroeconomic variables, they happen at the quarterly level. And we have fewer observations for the zero lower bound period. So perhaps that's why we did not attempt that analysis. But it's very interesting, and you actually have provided a good suggestion, because perhaps if we include the shadow rate, and data for the shadow rate has been available for a very, very long time period, then perhaps there is some sort of parametric way of putting in the zero lower bound while keeping the same model over time, and not having this model just for a fewer amount of quarters.
Right. Yeah, because the thing about the zero lower bound is, I think your story about the supply shocks was very convincing. And the only idea that I had was about the zero lower bound causing a mismeasurement again, because of this truncation of censoring of potential expectations. So I'm not sure whether you could say, look, all right, we have the story of the demand and supply shocks, but perhaps at the zero lower bound, if you're just talking about this agreement, it's dampened because of this truncation. That could be perhaps something. Another question that I had was, I guess I didn't quite understand about the SPF, in the sense of, are you claiming that the FOMC disagreement causes disagreement at the SPF, or is something driving both?
Yes, actually, we show the supply shocks drive both. So here we don't include the disagreement. Perhaps because we would have to put the disagreement today and then the disagreement in future periods. So we include the shocks, the supply and demand shocks, and then we say, well, since shocks are persistent, then this is likely to drive disagreement among the committee members and forecasters, both in the current quarter, but also in the future quarters, because these shocks have some persistence.
I guess a further discussion on what, I mean, the supply shocks, I think, as I said, I like the story, I understand it. It's just, can we dig deeper in these supply shocks? Because apparently they are affecting people, whether they're FOMC members or professional forecasters. They are affecting them differently, or maybe they have different preferences, but we don't know what these supply shocks are, right? Because obviously it's a very aggregate notion.
Yes, actually we have an analysis on that, but we kept it for an appendix.
Okay.
Because we have also an instrumental variable approach. So in that we use a narrative approach. So we use gas prices for supply shocks, like Valerie Raimi. And then for the demand shocks, we use the expenditures on defense because wars are unpredictable. And we use as an investment shock, which is also a demand shock, the spread between A and B firms, corporates. And for the monetary policy shock, we use the Romer and the Romer narrative shock. So when we use that, it has a very similar, everything is kept the same, yes.
And is the time series of the supply shock then also similar? Because
that I actually do not know.
Because
I cannot remember, because my co-authors did the instrumental variable analysis. I remember one of my co-authors did it and he kept it in the appendix. So I remember that the result was that it was robust. But pardon me if I cannot remember. Maybe if one of my co-authors wants to step in, João? Okay, well, it seems they are not stepping in.
I'm also here, I can also speak for that. But so what was the question on the length of the time series for the instrument?
No, so I mean the supply shock that you basically have identified, like I found it interesting that exactly when inflation goes down in the Volcker period, you say, well, now there are no supply shocks anymore, as if basically Volcker was just lucky. And I wonder whether that was also the same in the other way of identifying the supply.
Yeah, so the composition of the volatility of inflation across the different shocks comes out very similar if we're identifying the structural shocks using the instrumental variables, and particularly for the supply shocks. So there when we then use the volatility of inflation as a predictor for descent, those results come out very, very similar to the baseline. Yeah.
Thank you.
All right, great. Any last minute questions?
Okay.
Okay.
Well, thank you, Victor, for inviting us.
Well, thank you, Carlos. Thanks everybody for the presentation.